call you first witness.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. At this time, I would call Chris Havard. Mr. Havard. And just like you saw the previous witnesses, once you get up there to the you swear affirm testimony to give in this matter in the state versus Michael Chase Havard. All right, you can have a seat. Make sure you speak into the microphone.
Yes, sir.
Spell your full name.
My name is Chris Havard, C-H-R-I-S-H-A-V-A-R-D.
And how are you related to Mr. Havard, Michael Havard?
He is my son.
All right, and that's your actual blood relative son?
Yes, sir.
All right, and where do you live?
I live in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Could you state the address?
7221 Beaverwood Drive, Raleigh, North Carolina, 27616.
Now, the date of this incident is December 3rd of last year, correct?
Yes.
On the day after you heard this, or 2 days after this incident occurred, what did you decide to do at that point in time with your son?
I decided to come pick him up and bring him to Raleigh.
Okay, before that, where was he living?
He was living with his Uncle Robert and also residing at Whitewater Express, where he lived in a bungalow.
Which
where
is
he
a
worked.
is it on the river?
Yes, sir.
And it's designed to allow the employees to work there on the grounds or live there on the grounds?
Yes, sir.
But he also was living with his aunt and uncle, your brother, I believe, in Blue Ridge or Blairsville, really?
Blairsville.
Okay. Now, you've heard earlier the testimony in regards to his co-defendant that was just had his bond hearing, and your son grew up together?
Yes.
Okay. And I noticed that everyone stood earlier for him. Everyone's here to support both of these young men, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now, once and if the court were to grant a bond for Mr. Havard, you understand that he may not be able to live with you anymore in Raleigh, is that correct?
That is correct. I've already made arrangements.
Okay. And we'll get to that in a second, but while he was in Raleigh, what did you immediately do to get him situated?
He has a job in Raleigh, and he has been working 7 days a week with me.
Okay. And what do you do?
I am a salesman.
All right. And is it the roofing industry?
Yes, sir.
And he's been working in the roofing industry as well?
Yes.
Now, you say you've made arrangements. You understand that in the pendency of this, he may need to be required to remain in the area, specifically in the state of Georgia. You
Yes,
understand that?
Yes, sir.
And you said you've made accommodations. Who would he be living with if the court were to allow him a bond?
My mother.
And that's his paternal blood grandmother?
Yes.
Okay. And do you know where she lives?
Ella J.
Okay. And is that Diane Conway?
Yes.
And she's here today as well?
Yes.
Okay. Now, preferably, you would like for your son to continue to live with you in Raleigh. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in fact, he was living with you in Raleigh 2 weeks ago when you discovered that the Fannin County Sheriff's Department was looking for him, correct?
Yes, sir, I did.
And what did you do immediately after that?
Immediately got arrangements to get him back down here and turn himself in.
Okay. And like his friend, his friend was with him actually staying with you in Raleigh at the time, correct?
Correct.
And at that time, you made arrangements for both of them to return back to Georgia, correct?
Correct.
And like Mr. Chamaty, you went and retained an attorney on the Sunday that you got back to Georgia, correct?
Correct.
And on that following Monday morning, you had your son personally driven to the Fannin County Jail and turned himself in as well.
I personally drove him here and turned him in at 11 o'clock.
And do you believe that there's any risk that your son will flee the jurisdiction and or not come back to court?
No, sir.
And it's your understanding as well, based on the conversation and advice you gave your son before law enforcement knew about him, for him to go to law enforcement and let them know his involvement and what he knew.
Yes, sir, I did.
And he took your advice and fully cooperated as far as you know.
Yes, sir, he did.
Okay. And you've heard all the conditions that would be placed, or that a court would be placing if the court were to grant him bond. And your mom and you both would be willing to secure your personal wealth that if that he would not violate any of those conditions, correct?
Correct.
And do you believe that he's a threat to anyone in the community?
No, sir.
And do you believe he's a threat to commit any new felonies while out if he's been allowed to be on bond?
No, sir.
Now, you heard information about Mr. Chamaty. Did Mr. Havard finish high school?
Yes, he did.
Okay. And would you want him to continue to work as a condition of his bond?
Yes.
And alcohol and drugs, you would make sure that he was in a wholesome environment without any drugs or alcohol,
Correct.
subject to drug tests, just like any other conditions.
Yes.
Curfew as well,
Yes.
and also no firearms at your mom's house.
Correct.
And if you needed to, though, and he were to be allowed to live in Raleigh, you would assure and make sure he was here for any and all court dates as well.
Yes, sir.
But it's very important that the court knows that you have made arrangements for him to stay here in the area so he could testify and be available at any time.
Yes, sir.
Do you have any prior felonies?
No, sir.
That's all I have at this time, Your Honor.
Ms. Husby.
Mr. Havard, I have just a few questions. You had indicated that your son was living where prior to December of 2018?
He lived with his Uncle Robert in Blairsville through the winter time. During the summer, he would stay in a bungalow at the rafting company as he worked 5 days a week.
In that Spotwater Express?
Yes, ma'am.
And was that located in Copper Hill, Tennessee?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, was he living with your brother, his Uncle Robert, in Blairsville on the date of the incident in question on December 3rd, 2018?
I would say yes.
You would say yes, but you don't know?
Well, he's there through the winter time. That's usually where he is. He bounced between both. His Uncle Robert actually runs Whitewater Express.
Now, you haven't lived in the area for quite some time, is that correct?
It's been a few years, yes, ma'am.
Approximately when did you move to Raleigh, North Carolina?
3 years ago, I was residing in Loganville, Georgia before that. Actually, that would be Monroe, I'm sorry.
Now, do you or your family own any real property in Fannin County?
No, my mother lives in Gilmer.
Okay, and does she own real property in Gilmer
Yes.
County? Now, who resides with your mother in Gilmer County?
My mom, her husband, Mark, and her 2 sons,
And how old are those boys?
16 and 17, I think.
Now, you had previously referred to your son as Michael. Does he go by Michael or Chase?
Chase.
Okay, and I'm sorry, you said that Diane and Mark have 2 sons, 16 and how old?
16 and 17.
16 and 17. Now, how old is your son Chase?
20.
Is there a reason that he was not previously residing with Diane and Mark Conway in Gilmer County?
After he got out of high school, he kind of wanted to do his thing and work, so that's what he had been doing.
Now, do you know what job he did in the summer? Because I know that rafting would be a seasonal job, so did he hold down any employment during the winter months?
Yes, he worked at the actual grounds. He did weed eating, cutting grass, whatever they needed him for.
Now, you indicated that he had finished high school. What high school did he graduate from?
He didn't graduate high school. He finished the mountain educational thing there in Blue Ridge. And graduated this past year.
And what precipitated him going to mountain education as opposed to Fannin County High School, if that's where he was residing?
When he moved up, he come from Mississippi, and he didn't finish, or I'm not sure if he dropped out or he just didn't finish, and I was adamant to get him his GED. So that's what he had been doing, working on.
What was he doing in Mississippi?
That's where we're from originally.
Where is his mother?
She's in the courtroom.
Are y'all still together or?
We've been divorced for 4 or 5 years now.
That's why Miss Husby.
No. And what is his mother's name?
Dana Cupid.
And where does she reside?
She lives with my sister, my daughter Abby, in Fannin County.
And how old is Abby?
Abby is 21.
When he was attending, as you said, taking his degree this past year from Mountain Education, who was he residing with then?
With his Uncle Robert.
And he would have been 19 years of age at that point.
Yes, ma'am.
What other family that Mr. Havard is related to resides in the area?
It'd be his Uncle Robert, his Nana, Diane, his sister. I think that's all of the immediate family.
So we have your brother Robert being in Blairsville, your mother Diane being in Gilmer County, and Mr. Havard's mother being in Fannin, having Dana Cupid with your common daughter Abby that you have, excuse me,
Yes, ma'am.
with Miss Cupid. And why was the determination made that it would be appropriate for Mr. Havard to reside with your mother as opposed to his own?
That's just my preference, and she offered first.
Why was that your preference?
I mean, my preference. Why? No real reason.
And you indicated that your mother owns real property in Gilmer County.
Yes, ma'am.
May I have 1 second, Your Honor?
Okay.
Why did you take your son to Raleigh, North Carolina after this incident occurred?
Chase has been working with the rafting company, and I've had to pick up his bills at the end of every month. I've been helping him out with money, so I made it and make more money. It just wasn't able to make ends meet.
And you indicated that Mr. Chamaty was living there with him and you, is that correct?
Living where with him?
In Raleigh?
No, ma'am, he was just there to visit.
And how long has your son Chase been with you in Raleigh?
For a month, 2 months.
And you said you indicated you had been living there for 3 years, so what kind of contact did you have with Chase prior to you moving him to Raleigh?
He would come and see me. I would come down here a lot. I still periodically work on the river, so I'm always down there and have family here.
2 times a year, 3 times a year?
Probably more 6 or 7 here.
You indicated that you would have a preference, or I believe stated it would be an option for him to reside with you in Raleigh, is that correct?
Yes, I would like for him to come to Raleigh with me.
And that is at 7221 Beaverwood Drive, Raleigh,
Yes.
North Carolina?
Yes, ma'am.
And who resides in that house with you?
That would be me, my wife, and our 2 dogs.
And what is your mother's address, Ms. Conway?
311 Gunstock Creek Lane, Ellijay, Georgia, and I can't remember the zip code.
And what does Ms. Conway do for a living?
She is retired.
What did she previously do?
She worked in a hospital. I think she did mammograms, I think.
And what about her husband, Mr. Conway?
He is a truck driver.
I have nothing further at this time, Carl.
Did you read?
That's all I have.
You may step down, thank you.
The only other witness, Your Honor, would be Ms. Diane. Ms. Holloway, same table or chair up by the witness stand. If you can stand and raise your right. Raise your right hand. State first. Michael Havard with the
Okay, you can have a seat, and just speak into the microphone, and if you can start by pronouncing and spelling your full legal name.
Diane Lynn Conway, DianeLynnConway.
And how are you related to Mr. Havard, sitting to the left of me at the table?
He is my first grandson.
Okay. And could you state your address where you're living?
311 Gunstock Creek Lane, LJ, Georgia, 30540.
Okay. Now, first thing I want to clear up, those are your 16-year-old and 17-year-old grandchildren that live with you, correct?
Yes, they have lived with me since they were 5 and 6.
And they're not Mr. Havard's brothers, or sisters rather, they're first cousins.
That's correct.
Okay.
Full-blooded first cousins.
All right. And you're retired?
I am.
If the court were to require a condition that Mr. Havard, as a condition of his bond, to remain in your home on house arrest, except to go to church or to work or to see his attorney or appear in court, would you assure the court that he would abide by those conditions?
I would.
And would you be, first off, is your home paid for completely, or do you have a mortgage?
It's completely paid for.
And you and your husband are willing to put your home up and the security of your home to secure not only Mr. Havard's attendance in court, but his appearance in court and his cooperation on all the conditions the court would place on him?
I am.
Okay. And you had mentioned earlier that you would be taking Mr. Havard to church with you, is that correct?
Every time the doors are open.
Okay. And I understand, I imagine you're pretty upset about this whole situation.
I am.
Okay. Now, you would, I trust, do anything you can at this point to help your grandson succeed.
I would. I believe in him.
And do you believe that he's a threat to anyone in the community?
I do not.
And do you believe that he's a threat to flee the jurisdiction of the court or to not return to court as ordered?
Absolutely not.
And you understand that if the court were to grant the privilege of a bond for your grandson, and he were to violate any of the conditions at all, that he'd be subject to immediately be placed back under arrest and stay there until trial. You understand that?
I would report him.
Okay, thank you. As far as your husband, is he able to be at home at all, or is he always, is he long distance over the road trucker, or is he in town so he's able to spend the night at home every night?
No, sir. He's over the road and he stays gone usually 2 weeks out, 1 week in,
Okay.
usually, but that sometimes he stays out 3 weeks, according.
But you don't have any concerns as far as with him not being there, you don't feel like you would have any need or concern him not being there as far as if your grandson were allowed to stay with you?
No,
Okay.
I have no problems with that. His uncle is works for Fannin County Police Department.
Excellent. So
And
Mr. Havard's
I
uncle.
would call him in a heartbeat.
Okay.
Sorry, who is that that works for the?
Eric McQuigg.
Okay. Now, I think that's about all I have. I just want to make sure there's room, though, to accommodate Mr. Havard if he needed to stay with you for quite some time if this case lingered on, correct?
As long as need be.
Okay. And you're also aware that he may have to come to court to testify or in grand jury proceedings, and anything he needs to do, you would require or make sure it's facilitated, correct?
I would make sure.
And you're willing, again, to put up your wealth and your husband's wealth and your security of your home to bet on Mr. Havard, your grandson?
I have discussed it with my husband, and yes, we would.
All right. That's all I have this time, Your Honor.
Ms. Sylvia?
Ms. Conway, I have just a couple of questions. You were previously here for the bond hearing as it related to Mr. Kevin Jack, correct?
I was.
And you were placed upon the release for Mr. Chamaty. specifically up to and including in Mr. Hyde would times that he would take him to any doctor's appointments, lawyer appointments that may exist, to church, but that any time he would be outside of the home, that Mr. Hyde would be directly supervising Mr. Chamaty.
Yes, I understand that, but there's one problem. If he's to work, I don't know how I would be able to do that. I would just have to keep him at home with me.
Okay. Now, you indicated you had two grandsons that are living with you, a 16 and a 17-year-old.
Yes.
And I am sure that are they involved in school?
Oh, yes, ma'am.
Any extracurricular activities?
Devin plays football. He does.
Any concerns about being able to ensure your obligations to make sure that you have transportation for them, as well as if the court were to grant bond, you being with your grandson, Mr. Havard?
He's just going to have to go with me everywhere I go. I have no problems with it.
Okay. But if the court were to order that he is under house arrest, only to leave for the purposes of doctor's appointments, lawyer's appointments, church.
Well, I take the two boys to school and I pick them up. So I guess he could go with me to do that. If that's all right with the court.
And you understand the other ramifications that if your grandson were to violate the terms of his bond, that the property you put up could potentially be revoked by the court, and that is something that you're willing to do?
I am.
Nothing further.
Just very briefly, Your Honor. You heard earlier about the color wheel.
You understand that there's a potential, not a potential, a certainty that your grandson would have to call every day, and hits on that day would be required to immediately go report to a probation officer. You understand that that would be a condition of his probation, of his bond.
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. That's all I have.
Okay.
Any other questions? Let me step down, thank you.
That's all I have, Your Honor, other than argument.
Go ahead.
Well, and I will be brief, Your Honor, given what we've already heard today. I will just point out to the court that I believe, and just like I joined Mr. Steele in what he had to say in regards to this case and my client's involvement, he was contacted immediately by Fannin County Sheriff's Department. He immediately came back from Raleigh to Georgia, turned himself in, hired an attorney, has been in custody for approximately a week. He has no criminal history whatsoever. He's not a significant, I don't believe, a significant risk to either flee the jurisdiction, influence, or even have contact with any of the witnesses in this case, obstruct justice, or commit any new felonies. You've heard from his grandmother. I believe that she's credible and that she will do everything in her power to make sure, but it's really on Mr. Havard. But I believe in the short time I've met and known him, and the time I've met his father and known his father, I believe Mr. Havard knows how serious this is. Mr. Havard knew how serious it was that night. That's why the next day he contacted law enforcement himself and cooperated. I think the state would agree that he has completely cooperated in answering the GPI, the officer's questions. He came forward himself. And again, I would just ask that a reasonable bond be set with conditions. He knows that if those conditions are violated, that he would be back incarcerated, his grandparents would lose their home. His father is also here in support of him from Raleigh. He also understands, given the nature of these charges, that he may not be able to go back to Raleigh and work with his father. Perhaps that would be the best thing for him. But either way, Your Honor, we appreciate whatever consideration would be given as far as a reasonable bond to be set. And just particularly wanted to thank you and the DA's office for accommodating me today. Y'all didn't have to do this. We really appreciate it. His whole family appreciates us having this opportunity this morning.
Ms. Suspect, let me ask you a question, and the court remembers all your argument, but frankly, in this situation, I'd rather him be with a father, but I'm trying to figure out how to do that because he needs to work. But
Your
in
Honor,
Raleigh, North Carolina, I don't know how we would do that.
I don't know how, in terms of ensuring satisfaction of the requirements that the bond, if the court were to grant a bond that would be similar to Mr. Chamaty's, how we could ensure that Mr. Havard would not be violating the terms and conditions of the bond, ideally, if the court were to grant a bond for him to be gainfully employed. Unfortunately, I do not think that that circumstance exists for Mr. Havard as it does for Mr. Chamaty.
And Your Honor, we understand, and of course, his father understands that. His father's going to effort and try to find him some type of suitable employment locally. We certainly have no objection leaving that onus on us, that we can find him a job like his uncle who's willing to supervise him at all times. We certainly have no objection or no problem petitioning the court ourselves to make sure that you approve whoever's going to supervise him at all times if he's not going to be supervising home with his grandmother's. The only other suggestion I know of is to do some type of obvious waiver of extradition and the leg monitoring, extra security of a leg monitoring if you were going to allow him to be in Raleigh. He certainly has he is certainly prepared to incur the cost himself of leg monitoring if that's what you'd rather him do. Quite frankly, Your Honor, Mr. Havard and his family will do whatever the court wants him to do as far as where he lives and what he does as far as a living.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
The state's position coming into the hearings today as it would relate to both Mr. Chamaty and to Mr. Havard was an opposition of bond and a request for them to stay in custody. Of course, at the conclusion of Mr. Chamaty's bond hearing, the court has granted him a bond with rather stringent conditions with the assurance that if there is a violation of any of those conditions, that Mr. Chamaty would be taken into custody immediately. If the court does grant Mr. Havard a bond similar to Mr. Chamaty, we would certainly request the imposition of the same conditions that were previously imposed on Mr. Chamaty, up to and including that both Mrs. Conway and Mr. Chris Havard both sign on the bond, is that they have testified that he be required to reside with his paternal grandmother, Miss Diane Conway, at 311 Gunstock Creek Landing, is that correct? In Ellijay, Georgia. That there be no firearms, that he remain under house arrest, except to attend church, medical appointments, attorney appointments, and any court appearances, that any time that he be outside of that residence, that he be supervised at all times by Miss Diane Conway, that he not leave the state of Georgia, that he have no contact with co-defendants or their families, that he be subject to the color wheel, that should he be located outside of the state, that there would be a waiver of extradition. Of obvious concern in this case are the nature of the charges pending against Mr. Havard, and the state would certainly oppose Mr. Havard being relocated, I believe approximately 6 hours away in Raleigh, North Carolina, given everything that has been previously submitted to the court.
I don't necessarily disagree with you, but it appears that we're almost agreeing that if he works, that if he lives with Miss Conway, which frankly would be, that he would not be able to work unless she went with him, or maybe he would work. We could certainly more closely supervise because of him reporting to the county probation and so forth. What would be your position on him finding a job in Montgomery County, knowing that probably Mrs. Conway could not go with him?
What I would request in terms of, because there has been no establishment that he has a job or any type of set plan, that in the event that events do occur, that the onus be placed on the defense counsel to file a motion for modification of bond conditions to address it.
I think that's extremely appropriate given the facts of the situation. We just appreciate that consideration.
All right, well, let's do that with the same bond conditions, but he would live with Ms. Conway.
Yes, ma'am, Your Honor.
Again, same restrictions as far as house arrest, except for going to work. And at this point in time, we would even have to come back and to see if they, modification, how that would be handled. But in the event, I approved it because he's not gonna have someone with him the whole time, like Mr. Hyde's gonna be with the other co-defendant, that I do agree with Ms. Sosby that it would border electronic monitoring.
Correct, Your Honor.
With all the other same terms and conditions, frankly, that the other co-defendant had.
Yes,
So
sir.
it would cover
Yes,
it.
ma'am. Yes, ma'am, Your Honor. And I agree with my previous attorney as well, that I've already advised my client if he signs something to the Fannin County Jail once a bond is prepared. The state has been extremely gracious and professional with emailing me as well. I don't think there'll be any problems in regards to
Okay, and
logistics.
so his dad would also sign up on a $50,000 bond.
Correct. His dad and mom, who will both understand that they will both be using mom's property to transfer bonds with Gilmer Sheriff's Department and then, of course, with the father as well.
So it would be the exact same conditions, Ms. Sosby, except for not knowing where he would work. They would have to come back and ask for modification on that. And at a minimum, we would require the electronic monitoring. So if that was something that he came back and you agreed with in terms of the job, as long as there was electronic monitor, the court would sign off on that.
Correct, Your Honor.
It appears that it looks like the state is preparing to get this presented to a grand jury, and a case of this nature certainly would be put on a fast track.
Yes,
I
ma'am.
think I made that pretty clear at the other bond, as we do have some defendants who were denied bond because of a lot of
Correct.
other reasons.
Correct.
So,
Yes, ma'am. And I also want to just, if I may, in my client's family's presence, and of course my client, it's my understanding that Wednesday or Thursday of this week, he's going to potentially be needed both days, all day, to potentially testify to a grand jury. If that's the case, I just want to make sure he and his family know that this week it's moving very fast, and potentially this week he could be needed. I don't know if that's the case or not, but I just want to make sure he knows, that his family knows, that they need to stay in touch with the state as far as anything like that goes.
And I will speak with you regarding
how would that
those
happen
issues.
with him being charged?
Well, yes, we'll see what happens, but I just want to make sure my family knows that as well.
Your Honor, in relation to a comment regarding property bond, I understand that Ms. Conway owns property in Gilmer County. Of course, this is a Fannin County case. Any property bonds would be subject to the approval of the Fannin County Sheriff. Of course, we do not have any objection to that, but I certainly do not want to be in a position or there be a misrepresentation, because that would certainly be the sheriff to approve that.
Yes, if someone would have to approve it, then it would have to be approved by a sheriff's department. Yes,
Yes.
that's correct.
Yes, ma'am.
Any other issues in reference to this matter?
None from the defense.
Okay, and so, Ms. Sosby, are you drawing up, adding to it the other conditions of bond to that, and going to email it, and then provide it to the court, or going to be the same procedure as the last one, or what?
Your Honor, my intent is to draft the bonds immediately upon being excused from court. I will send bonds respectively to each defense counsel. Upon their approval, I submit to the court for signature. Prior to the filing of those bonds with the Fannin County Clerk's Office, those bonds will be presented to the defendants, Mr. Chamaty and Mr. Havard, for their signature and acknowledgement of bond conditions. We will file those, and then we will transmit stamped file copies to defense counsel for their records, if that is acceptable to the court.
Yes.
It's very acceptable to the defense.
You know, we have we have a lot of young people in the room, so, and I can imagine they're all gonna roll their eyes, but sometimes making one little decision can impact the rest of your life. So I hope that if nothing else good comes out of this case, that people in this area, particularly those young people in this area, whether you be 15 or 20, will understand a mistake can cost you the rest of your life of serving in the state prison system. So think twice who you hang around with, and mamas and daddies and grandparents, you know, that's the key when kids are in high school or out of school, is that who they hang around will determine pretty much how they conduct themselves. So whether they be 15 or 20, you might want to take an active role in that, unless you want to be visiting them from now on at the state prison system or at the local jail, because I am not convinced that people all of a sudden get up in the morning and decide they're going to commit these types of horrible crimes. Obviously, from other hearings, there was some planning that went into it. At least these two at least initially declined, but then got involved. But you want to think about who you hang around with, or who you let your children hang around with. And for some of you, you need to decide that you're through with violating the law as well, because whatever parents do, we do set an example for our children. And this all the way around, it's a horrible situation for everyone in this particular case. So one bad decision can mess up the rest of your life. So hopefully you are learning and understanding that you need to not make some of the mistakes that have been made in this case. All right, we'll stand adjourned in this case.